Well, welcome to Dairy Livestream. I'm your host, Corey Geiger, managing editor of Hoard's Dairyman. We are broadcasting from the Cheese Cave, our studio in downtown Fort Atkinson at the historic W.D. Hoard & Sons Company building, commissioned by Wisconsin's Governor W.D. Hoard, who also a former governor who also started Hoard's Dairyman. We have four great panelists, and they all look forward to answering your questions. You may ask a question by submitting it into the GoToWebinar control panel. I'd also like to remind our audience to ask questions early to ensure we have time to answer them during our webcast as we delve through, can we improve federal milk marketing orders? This talk wraps into a 6-part dairy live stream series on milk pricing and potential federal milk order reform. As you will recall, we had a webcast that was the same title as April 7th, and we brought this back because this is a very deep conversation. On March 3rd, we talked about Let's Unpack Block and Barrel Cheese Pricing with Ted Jacoby, Kurt Eprick, and Mark Stevenson. We followed that with the March 24th Dairy Live Stream, What's the Balance Between Retail and Farm Gate Prices with Kroger's Mike Brown, Jeff Schwager with Sartori, and Andy Novakovic. Next came April 7th Dairy Live Stream, Can We Improve Federal Milk Marketing Orders? And we had Erin Taylor on that, and we welcome her back. We had Land O'Lakes' Tom Wagner and Calvin Covington as well, along with Andy Novakovic. April 21, What Processors Learned from the Pandemic? Agermark's Brian Weller joined us, and the Wisconsin Cheesemaker Association's John Umphafer and Mark Stevenson from UW-Madison were on that episode. All these episodes can be found at www.hoardsdairyman or hoards.com, www.hoards.com, and we have a drop-down menu with our webcast. Today, again, we will have a robust discussion on can we improve federal milk marketing orders? With 4 guests waiting in the wings, let's go straight to our first poll question. How many of today's guests work at or previously worked in the federal order system? Select one of the following, 1, 2, 3, or 4. We have 4 guests, so you can learn a little bit about our guests in that way. If you're watching on your computer or your smartphone, you can vote. If you're listening in an audio-only mode, and some of our viewers do that, it's a little more challenging to vote because you do need a screen to do that. So let's go ahead and cut our poll question off here. The correct answer, and the audience got the correct answer, is 3, and 41% of you got that correct. Our first guest is one of those 3, and we're starting out with Ed Gallagher, who grew up working on his family's Gallagher family dairy farm in Sangerfield, New York. From 1987 to 1996, Ed served as an agricultural economist and then as chief of market analysis, research, and information with the New York, New Jersey Federal Milk Marketing Order. For the next 14 years, Ed first held a role as Director of Planning and Regulatory Policy, then Vice President of Regulatory and Planning Policy, and later as Vice President of Economics and Risk Management, all with Dairy Lee Co-op in New York. Since 2010, Ed has served as president of Dairy Farmers of America Risk Management Division. Ed, you've seen federal milk marketing orders in action from many sides. What's your take on future enhancements?
Well, thank you, Corey, and thank you for inviting me to participate today. I've been impressed with the lineup of speakers that you've had on various topics, and it certainly has caught my eye. A number of my friends have participated, and hopefully I can do as good of a job helping provide a little information on this particular topic as others have in prior discussions. You know, not wanting to repeat the great information that was provided by the speakers in the first panel on federal orders, there is one area that I'd just like to comment on initially, amongst a couple others that I'll get to. But one is, you know, it's important that with the federal order process that there's a balanced approach. And Erin talked about that in the prior webinar, where she talked about balancing consumer, producer, and processor interests. And that is very important. And, you know, the process of it is important, you know, at every level. And certainly at DFA. We look at that balance, right? We're balancing the interests of a diverse producer community of our members. from Amishmen in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, to 10,000 cow dairies in New Mexico, from members in Maine to members in California. We're balancing their interests. We're also balancing the interests of our producers, our members, balancing the interests of the investments they've made in manufacturing and processing facilities, as well as balancing the interests of DFA and the partners we work with within the industry, selling milk to, supporting their businesses. So there's that balance happens within DFA whenever federal orders are considered, whenever there's issues about federal orders or any type of marketing issue in the United States. And then we go a step further after we balance it within DFA. Then we go and we try to balance it within what's important in the industry. Certainly influential with us is balancing the interests within the National Milk Producers Federation member cooperatives. We're strong members, strong supporters of the National Milk Producers Federation. And so as we get to a point where we're proposing a change, we've done a lot of that balancing already within our organization and within the industry as we come and present something to USDA for a change. You know, other important aspects that I want to make sure we get out on the table. You know, the first federal order was back in St. Louis, back decades ago. And certainly when that order came together and was implemented, it wasn't dealing with national issues. It was dealing with milk marketing challenges within the greater St. Louis region. And as the other orders came about and peaked at 83, they were all dealing with regional issues. And so now, even today, when we have 11 orders, there still are regional issues. Certainly the challenges of getting milk to Miami, Florida are different than getting milk to Seattle, Washington, are different than getting milk to Class 1 plants in Madison, Wisconsin, or New York City. So it's important that within these broader national themes, when we get to national pricing issues, that there still remains flexibility within the regions to resolve the challenges that are faced by the businesses, the handlers in those regions. The other thing I would say is, you know, as we think about, do we want to change sort of the pricing structures? That is part of what people want to think about. I'd say, you know, it's important to keep the interface with the dairy farmer simpler rather than more complicated, right? You know, the processors, the manufacturers, the cooperatives, they've got people like me, right, that can spend lots of time figuring out the complications on the handler end. But dairy farmers don't have that time, right? They're CEOs, they're CFOs, they are the chief scientists, and sometimes they are the tractor drivers, right? They don't have time to have something that they have to deal with that's complicated. So as we make adjustments to interface with dairy farmers, that we want to keep it simple. The next thing I want to say is, you know, we've got many of you know Ernie Yates. Ernie Yates has a saying: "You need a strong federal order or a strong cooperative." And I would say you need a strong federal order and you need strong cooperatives, because they're partners together. Since the beginning of federal orders, the dairy cooperative community have been partners with USDA in helping make the federal orders work. And there's lots of examples I could give about how this partnership has supported the operations of the federal order to make it work for everybody. As an example, when the three orders in the Northeast were merged back in the late 90s, we had a New England order, a Mid-Atlantic order, and the New York, New Jersey order. And I was predominantly working at the time, I was working at DairyLivestream predominantly with members and with operations in the New York, New Jersey order. And there were some vastly different provisions between the three orders. In the New York, New Jersey order, we had this system of pricing back to producers that was called farm point pricing. All the other orders across the United States had plant point pricing. So plant point pricing means The milk price a farmer gets is dependent on the plant that receives their milk. In the old New York, New Jersey order, the milk price a dairy farmer received was based on where their farm was located in relation to New York City. And so we realized early on that we weren't going to be able to convince USDA to have farm point pricing for the new order. So we accepted plant point pricing. But it was going to create a confusing issue for dairy farmers in their milk shed. And so DairyLivestream then, on its own, went and developed its own farm point pricing to pay its members that sort of was superimposed over the federal order to make it work better. In fact, I think throughout the Northeast now, most of the dairy cooperatives use that farm point pricing program. So it's a partnership that dairy cooperatives have with USDA to help the orders work better. The last thing I'm going to comment on, then I'll pass the talking stick on, is that we're going to change federal order pricing. It's really, really, really important to make sure that whatever pricing we have is congruous with the ability to use milk price risk management programs. The United States is the envy of the world because of the rich development, robust opportunities dairy farmers and milk processors have to manage their milk price risk. Every other major dairy area in the world wants to have what we have. Some are trying to do it, and despite my close friends at some of the brokerages and what they may say, I would debate them and say, they're nowhere close to having what we have. We don't want to give that up. That is so important. Despite what we can do, what we do with federal order pricing provisions and the interface back to the producers on how they get priced, we are going to be subject to so much price volatility forever that we need these tools to be able to help dairy farmers manage those programs. And I can tell you, I could line up lots of DFA members who have been using these risk management programs for decades now, who are in business and who have been able to be more consistently profitable by using those programs than a lot of other dairy farmers who've never used them. So it's really important to maintain the ability to use those risk management. With that, I'll stop and thank you for allowing me to, for a few moments of opening comments.
Thank you, Ed. And as a reminder to our audience, and we do have a number of questions that came in already, if you have a question about one of our panelists, go ahead and type that into the GoToWebinar control panel. And my coworker, Caitlin, will get those up on the screen here, and we'll reply to you if we need any clarification. With that, let's go to another poll question. What is a handler in a federal milk marketing order? So there's a very specific definition of a handler. Select one of the following: a processor of raw milk, a dairy cooperative, both A and B, or none of the above. So go ahead and answer that one as we continue this discussion on federal orders. And we'll wait until we get a good majority of our audience in on that one. And with that, let's go ahead and cut the poll off. 72% did answer this correctly. Now, if you picked A or B, you got it partially correct, but it's both A and B. A handler is a processor of raw milk. So anyone processing milk into any dairy product. And a handler can also be a dairy cooperative that has full authority of the sale of a member's milk. Now, there's a few marketing cooperatives over there, so that's a little different than a one with processing plants. We welcome Al Zolin to DairyLivestream. Earlier in his career, Al had aspirations to work for the Internal Revenue Service that many of us simply call the IRS. Without any openings at the moment of his hire, the IRS had Al work for USDA's Agricultural Marketing Service at the start of his career. He found the work so enjoyable that Al stayed at the old Federal Order number 30, even after the IRS had an opening Al had originally aspired to when he first went to work for them. Al eventually moved on to work with Kraft's Dairy Procurement Division for 25 years and now has his own consulting service, Zolin International. Al, quite frankly, when I talk to others, I count you among the short list of people who are gurus when it comes to federal milk marketing orders. Al, what might the future hold?
For that introduction, Corey. I don't know if I fall into that category, but I will say one thing about the simplicity of the federal orders, because there was talked a little bit about that the last broadcast. I found federal orders to be more complex than the tax code when I first was introduced to it, and that's what really drew me to it. And as it's grown over the years, it continues to be a challenge as we look to try to put those pieces together of the puzzle. In the corner of my screen, I see this question: can we improve federal milk marketing orders? And certainly changes can be made. Hopefully those changes are made administratively and not through Congress. But to consider the change and improvement is a really difficult question. And that answer depends on your perspective. As a dairy farmer, certainly I think price enhancement would be something that they would consider an improvement. But as a processor of dairy products, that higher price may be a problematic issue because it may make them uncompetitive in the marketplace, trying to compete with substitute items that can be substituted for their product. Whenever USDA makes a decision, I usually see in the paper or in other publications a litany of economists talking about, on one hand, the impact is going to be this, and on the other hand, the impact is going to be that. Certainly, changes to federal orders sometimes have unintended consequences. I think we're seeing a little bit of that now with the Class 1 mover. But certainly, true improvement in the federal order system would be one that certainly has to increase the overall total revenue in the pool that is available to satisfy the dairy farmer. Secondly, it has to keep processors whole and allowing them to be competitive in the marketplace. And thirdly, be flexible enough to answer the consumer who wants and needs high quality and innovative dairy products. I don't know if that type of improvement exists, and I know it certainly cannot be made by small tweaks to the system. But if we keep that major idea as a goal, one day I think we actually will achieve a system that is considered an improvement by all participants. With that little preamble, I'd like to kind of highlight a number of issues that I think that have to be part of the overall change matrix to make things work. First, and these are a kind of a laundry list of a number of issues that are all interlinked. And that's one thing about federal orders. You make one change and it changes something else. So you really, really have to think about the whole ball of wax. And the way I lump three major items together that are all being talked about today, we talked about Class 1 movers prior as well as now. So the whole Class 1 pricing system is an interesting concept. Advanced pricing, which is kind of hidden in the background of this whole thing, is a little bit problematic in some of my other two items as far as deep pooling of milk as well as negative PPDs, because the timing of when prices are used to calculate the class prices can create problems because we have very volatile markets these days. There really is no easy answer to solve all these problems. But if you look at them in totality and try to address them as a total solution, I do believe improvements can come about. The second area that I really feel we have to pay some attention to is this whole concept of end product pricing for manufactured products. The only way an end product pricing formula can work is if their factors or the parts of the components of the formula are updated on a regular basis. I don't remember exactly how long ago the last hearing was for the Class 3 make allowance, but it's been over at least 10, maybe even 15 years before there's been some changes to that factor. That's a little too long to make things work. I know from a standpoint, there's a lot of tweaks we can make to the formula. Certainly, indexing some of the components to the consumer price index, fuel prices, expanding the products that we survey to go into the formula calculation can all help. But in my opinion, a better solution would be to go back. I hate to say go back, back to the future, I guess. Go back to a competitive price formula. Back in the 80s, the MW price series based on grade B milk worked quite effectively until the amount of grade B milk declined so far that it was no longer reliable. But today, in the upper Midwest, the Northwest, the Southwest, there's significant volumes of reserve milk out there that can be used to put a competitive price formula together again for manufactured products. Competitive price formulas are current. Every time a processor pays for milk, that price is reflecting the current market conditions that are out there. Don't have to go to hearings every year or every 2 years to change the formula components, because they're all built in to what the handler is deciding to pay for milk. So finally, my last item on the list is something that is kind of in the federal order domain, but I don't think it's actually something that gets changed in a hearing, and that would be block voting. It seems to be an issue, and it has been an issue in the past. It seems to be an issue again. As recently as the California promulgation hearing a few years ago, there was quite a lot of discussion about whether or not individual producers that were also independent producers as well as members of cooperative were going to be able to vote individually. We'll see. And again, I'm reading about that in the news again today, that block voting is coming up as an issue. The reason for block voting way back when it was put in maybe has changed. The sophistication of the dairyman today is significantly different than where it was in the 40s and 50s. So certainly, is it time to change block voting? Time will tell if USDA and the industry can get together on whether or not is that something that needs to be talked about and to change. But if we ever do go to a federal milk marketing hearing to make changes, and the proposals that I've talked about are addressed, the question will still remain what USDA has decided and what producers have voted on. Is it an improvement? And as I started this conversation, the answer to that question will still depend on what your perspective is. And with that, thank you very much for your time and your patience. And Corey, I'd like to turn it back to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Al. I definitely appreciate it. We have a number of questions coming in, so audience can continue to ask those. Before we invite our third dairy live stream guest, let's go to another poll question. Federal orders establish minimum prices paid to farmers by A, collecting dairy commodity market prices, B, determining handler prices based on end use, C, establishing minimum uniform prices through pooling, D, all the above, E, none of the above. Go ahead and answer that one. And in the background here, as a co-producer to the show, I see that a number of you are well on your way to getting that correct. And for the sake of time, we'll go ahead and terminate or shut the poll down. And the right answer is all of the above. Changing or amending a federal order is an elaborate undertaking. With that in mind, we welcome back Erin Taylor to Dairy Livestream. Erin has worked with USDA's Agricultural Marketing Service, which many of us simply call AMS, for 20 years. At AMS, Erin serves as Director for Order Formulation and Enforcement Division. Erin, since you last appeared on Dairy Livestream, word in the countryside has it that an emergency petition may be filed requesting a hearing on the Class 1 mover. What might that mean if that petition gets filed, Erin?
Yeah, good morning, Corey. I just want to say thanks again for inviting USDA back. It's very timely. As you mentioned, USDA does anticipate at some point probably getting an emergency hearing request. And since last time I joined you, we have gotten a lot of questions on what does that mean when people say, what is the emergency hearing process? So I'm going to concentrate my remarks mostly on that, explaining that process. So unlike when I was here a few weeks ago discussing normal rulemaking procedures, which are all clearly defined in regulation, the emergency process isn't quite as clear. I can't quite point to a set of regulations that determine how that process works. But it really is twofold. First, proponents can put forth an argument that emergency conditions exist, that the department should move quickly to a hearing. So under normal circumstances, we like to give about 30 days notice to the industry that we're going to hold a hearing. The statute says we have to provide 15 days notice, or if it's an emergency, at least 3 days notice. So those are the statutory frameworks that we have to fit in. So in the emergency proposal package, the proponents need to address what conditions exist that warrant bypassing these normal procedures that we should move quickly to a hearing. Once we move to a hearing, there's another set of emergency conditions we take testimony on. So witness can discuss what conditions exist to warrant emission of a recommended decision. Now that's the procedure I talked about before under normal processes. And if USDA agrees that these conditions exist, we would emit a recommended decision, issue a tentative final decision. So the difference there is when we issue a recommended decision, we take public comment. The secretary considers those comments and then issues the final decision, which producers vote upon. If we go to a tentative final decision, it allows us to conduct a vote immediately without taking public comment and considering those comments first. We still do take public comment, but that happens concurrently. So if producers approve the proposed amendments in the tentative final decision, we issue them on an interim basis. Then we'll come back and consider the public comments received and then issue a final decision. And then there is a second vote. So at that time, producers end up voting on the same amendments if there was no changes, or if USDA finds cause to make changes based on comments received, they would vote on those new changes. Generally speaking, going to a tentative final decision instead of a recommended decision cuts out around 4 to 5 months out of the process from when an amendment can actually be implemented. But I do want to reiterate that proponents have to show good cause exists to warrant going straight to a producer vote without considering public comment first. So as I've explained before, the formal rulemaking process is designed to maximize transparency and participation. So any steps taken to alter that public participation process are not considered lightly. So just coming to USDA and asking the secretary to issue a rule on an expedited basis is not adequate. They have to put evidence on the record to support that position. I do want to point out that emergency conditions were successfully argued a number of times in the 2000s on a series of pooling hearings we held around the country. And in those proceedings, witnesses did make a compelling argument, and the secretary agreed that emergency conditions were warranted to issue a tentative final decision. And in addition, the most recent emergency hearing we had was the Florida emergency hurricane proceeding in 2017. That was conducted on an emergency basis, where we actually skipped a tentative final decision. The secretary issued a final decision. There was one vote, and the changes were implemented. But in this proceeding, it was less than a day. There was no opposition. The industry was in consensus on the changes that they wanted. They were seeking approval of from the department. So moving to a final decision was found warranted. And that whole process in that Florida example took about 7 months from receipt of proposal to implementation. I do want to end my comments quickly addressing another question that's been raised recently, and that's how does the secretary go about the policy analysis used to determine what changes to recommend? So as I explained a few weeks ago, the secretary can only consider evidence that's put on the hearing record. So that's why the rulemaking process is designed to maximize participation, to make sure those that want their views considered are able to be heard and participate. Once the hearing's over and the presiding official certifies the record, the department has to sort through all the evidence, all the data and testimony presented. So the first kind of hurdle that we look at is determining if, after evaluating all that evidence, is the proposed change even authorized by the act? Is it legal? Many people can have great ideas about what changes they want to see to federal orders, but if the authorizing legislation doesn't provide for those types of changes, then the secretary doesn't have the legal authority to propose that those changes be made. Then we move on to analyzing the issue that was raised. Is it something that needs to be addressed through government regulation, or is it something the market should be able to correct on its own? Do the proposed solutions offered at the hearing address the issue that's been raised? What aids us in making that determination is looking at the data presented, the arguments presented at the hearing, both in support and opposition. And we have some pretty sophisticated econometric models we use for policy impact analysis to help us quantify expected impacts of the policy change. So in addition, as been said before and said already today on this webcast, all of this, we must also weigh the different sides of what I'll now term the three-legged stool: producers, processors, and consumers. We have to take all of those interests in consideration when making a determination. And I'll close just highlighting that when the secretary does issue a decision, whether it be a recommended decision or a tentative final decision, it contains a very thorough summary of the hearing record and of the evidence that was used when making the determination, and a detailed justification of why the order as proposed to be amended is the best means for carrying out the policy of the Act. So there's no doubt about why USDA or why the secretary made a determination. It is all laid out for everyone to read and then offer their comments on. So with that, I'll pass it back to you, Corey.
Thank you, Erin. We're going to go to our final poll question here, as leading up to hearing from Chris Wolf. In 2020, U.S. butterfat levels averaged 3.95%. What is the all-time record? Select one of the following: 3.98, 4.03, 4.08, and 4.13. As people vote on this, this is a USDA data set. Some of it's online, but it traces back to 1924. We have an old USDA publication here with all that in. And I think people are going to be very interested to hear that this peak, the butterfat levels peaked during World War II in 1944 and 1945. So we're going to go ahead and cut the poll off. The correct answer is we are near a record. The correct answer is 3.98%. That is the highest butterfat levels in the U.S. milk supply since the data collection began in 1924. So pre-World War II, it hovered in the 3.9 range, but it never went above 4. Now, butterfat levels are in demand, and the products with whole milk are in demand. And we're going to welcome back Chris Wolf to Dairy Livestream. We're having this critical discussion today regarding federal orders, and you've been in the field and online having a number of grassroots meetings with folks on the subjects. What have you been hearing, Chris?
Well, thanks, Corey. Thanks for having me today. So if federal milk marketing orders in their current iteration are essentially about a generation old, right? About 20 years old. And as we might expect, there's issues that might reasonably require attention and updating, like make allowances that have been mentioned that haven't been updated in more than a decade, right? Pooling rules, many potential pricing issues. But I want to talk just for a couple minutes here about producer price differentials, as those seem to be the key focus of some of the federal milk marketing order concerns today. Right, and I mean, we all know this, but just as a reminder, the producer price differential is the value of the pool in excess of the component values paid to Class 3. And anything that decreases the pool value relative to Class 3 or increases Class 3 relative to the pool value is going to decrease the producer price differential, everything else equal. So it's worth considering what factors drive producer price differentials. And there's a lot of different ways to slice it. But I think it's useful to kind of think about component tests and trends in component tests, utilization and trends in those, advanced versus announced prices, which can be affected by cheese, in particular cheese market rallies and crashes. Class 1 pricing rules, like Class 1 mover that gets affected by the spread now between Class 3 and 4, and then depooling. So traditionally, we kind of thought in the story, it kind of been that we would expect that negative PPDs were driven by cheese market rallies, right? With advanced pricing and the lag in that working through, then, we would think that cheese market rallied, and we're going to see that, we're going to see that next month for the most part. And so that's okay. It kind of smooths things out. Maybe we're not super happy about not getting it right away, but it's coming. But there's these other factors that have kind of come in more recently. The long-term trend has been for increased components. Corey just said that the highest annual average, right, was back around World War II. But we've definitely seen an increase under multiple component pricing in the last couple decades, increased both butterfat and protein and other solids, and in every order. A little more in some orders than others, but the trend has definitely been up. And when you pay for all of the components at class 3 first, if you increase components, everything else equal, you're going to have a lower PPD. And so that is contributing to kind of a lower expected producer price differential. Another factor is the long-term utilization trends. So if we have a decreasing amount of class 1 utilization and increasing cheese, yogurt, butter, depending on which order you're in, and cheese has certainly been the king, then that's going to pull down that producer price differential expectation also. And then the change in the class 1 mover that was made in the 2018 Farm Bill, which is getting a lot of attention, which moved from the higher of to the average plus 74 cents. That's been a big focus, and I think justifiably so. Prior to 2020, prior to the pandemic and the volatility that we saw there had been 6 months when the price of class 3 minus the price of class 4 was greater than $5 a hundredweight in 19 years. Then in 2020, we had 5 months in 2020 where that spread was greater than $5. In fact, 2 months greater than $10, and 3 more months where it was greater than $7. So, and that was driven by a number of different factors that I hope we don't have to deal with again from the pandemic, including, a quick movement to retail and in eating at home as opposed to eating out, and what that did to cheese consumption, and then the food box program and what that did to cheese demand. And then also, I think you also got to consider the fact that to balance those markets last year, we made a lot of butter. We ate a lot of butter, and that's a good thing. But we also made a lot of butter, and that kind of contributed to that spread. And so that got a lot of attention. And also, Al brought this up, that, the spread there also affected the incentive to depool. And depending on which order you're in, the incentive to depool and the difficulty of getting back into the pool vary, depending on, and so that effect was not uniform. And so all of the magnitudes of these different effects varied across orders based on utilizations and trends and rules in pooling. And so I think everybody's done a really good job here of setting up what these different considerations are, but those are some of the factors that we've been dealing with, and I'm looking forward to taking questions.
And so we have a lot of questions here. We're going to go straight to speed round, and for our commentators, I am going to use my best judgment and call on a person to answer the question. If any of the other commentators have something brief to add, I'm going to ask that you jump in, but we want to try to get all the audience questions answered. And one quick thing on that data set, how has butterfat changed? It's changed quickly. In 2010, the average U.S. butterfat in the United States was 3.66%. That was 2010, 3.66%. Just consider this. From 1966 to 2010, butterfat just ranged from 3.64 to 3.69, just 0.5 of 100, or 0.05. So a tight window. The market has changed. Erin, we're going to start the first question with you. The question, we talked a lot about how voting takes place under a normal hearing process. If we have an emergency hearing, do farmers vote too, or how does that look?
Sure, great question, Corey. The vote happens the same way. There's no change in the way the vote happens. So regardless of how we get to a vote at that point, farmers that do not belong to a cooperative are sent their own individual ballot to vote. And cooperatives have the option of block voting on behalf of their members, or choosing to have us send ballot to each of their members. So the process itself and who's allowed to vote does not change.
Thank you. So let's go to another question here. What would it take, Al, to get to one national set of rules on depooling? We talked about regional issues, but is that a pipe dream?
To me, it would not work because currently we have 11 orders or so, 10, 11 orders. They're all set up based on the needs for that marketing area, and depooling and even the provisions to repool milk are all based on the conditions in that marketplace. There's a 125 rule. I think there's a 135 rule. So from a standpoint, and I think there's a rule we just come back in, From an overall standpoint, to get a national solving depooling is not as simple as making a rule for it nationally. You've got to fix those whole pricing disparities that happen. It's much more complicated than just a rule targeting depooling. One easy answer, though, mandatory pooling, which kind of goes against the entire principle of where the federal order started. So, and I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Al. And this is kind of a follow-up, and you led right into it, and we're going to send this one over to Ed. We're still talking about negative PPDs and depooling and how it could be addressed. Should it only be allowed annually, Ed? Is that too restrictive?
So make a decision once a year to depool and you're off. It can be considered, in the California order, we wanted to have DFA, Land O'Lakes, CDI, we all want to have more restrictive pooling provisions. We didn't win out on that. So, I would agree with Al. It needs to be on a sort of a region by region, order by order basis. But I think there's some consideration to tightening up some of those pooling provisions to make it not as lucrative or as opportunistic to depool as what we've seen. I would also say, though, you got to be a little bit careful, because let's hope by God that we don't have another pandemic or see the volatility that was created because of the pandemic. So let's just take that into consideration as we're thinking about some of these changes as well. Thank you for the question.
And Corey, I'll jump in real fast. The 125 rule, if you take all your milk out, it'll take you 4 months to get back in. So we already have a quarter of a year as the penalty for depooling.
Thank you. Great addition. Chris, you're up next. A quick explanation of make allowance, and do these dollars go directly to a processor who manufactures those processes, or how does make allowance work?
Well, the make allowance is what we put into, when we start with product pricing, which is what we've done for the last couple of decades, we've got to work it back to what that means to a producer price. And the make allowance is the allowance that's in there for the manufacturing costs that have occurred. And as Al and others have pointed out, they haven't been changed in a long time. And the world has changed in that time as far as technology, energy costs, labor costs, and things of that nature. So it doesn't guarantee anybody, especially if we set them at the average. It depends on what the manufacturing costs look like, distribution behind that, and who we're talking about.
Erin, I think you can take this question here, and it comes from a banker who listens to most of our webcasts here. Tell us the question. I'm going to read the question as it is, but I'm going to ask you to tell us what federal orders do. In my working knowledge is they set minimum prices. The question comes in, there may be dairy producers who I work with who think federal order reforms could lead to, say, $30 milk, but that's nearly what really federal orders do, he says. So, go ahead and answer that the best you could.
Sure, great question. So federal orders, and I'll go back to kind of, again, what does the act authorize us to do? So that's always the key when considering how the provisions can be made. So the act authorizes us to have minimum prices to producers. Handlers pay these minimum classified prices, and producers get a minimum weighted average price. So it's designed to kind of set this basis for everyone to operate under. And that also means that the market can operate on top of federal orders. So there are premiums that happen in the marketplace every day and such that allow for additional revenue to be gathered by producers. But federal orders just kind of provide that minimum baseline for what producers should be paid for their milk, reflective of actual prices in the marketplace.
Ed, I'm going to send this next question to you. It's a little bit longer here, but it's a bit theoretical. But earlier in your comments, you talked about the importance of federal orders and the need to maintain them. Would in theory be beneficial to support a change to eliminate the current policy whereby an order is terminated when a referendum doesn't acquire? So if you make a change and you don't get 2/3 vote and the order goes out, should that rule stay in place? Is kind of where this audience members going towards.
Yeah, okay, so you're asking an old federal order employee about that one, but I'll be balanced in my approach. I think it's appropriate, right? So, these things are complicated, and in order for the federal order program to be successful, you need to have a majority of the dairy farmers, whether they're through their cooperatives or individually or combination of both, to be supportive of it. And if you don't have that, there's just going to be so many issues with the way that order is going to operate that it probably implodes. And so to have that 2/3 or better requirement, I think, requires everybody to come together, just like we do in the United States Congress, right? The United States Congress, granted, not everything is on a 2/3 vote in the United States Congress, but it's what's best for everybody. And in some cases, in a lot of cases, what's best for it doesn't mean it's best for everyone, but what's best for the majority, and in this case, what's best for the supermajority. So I think it's appropriate to maintain that decision process of at least 2/3 voting in favor.
Thank you, Ed. We are getting a lot of questions, and I really appreciate the commentators. We're going a good pace here, and we're going to keep this up. And Al, the next question is to you, and I'm going to read it just as it comes in. I think it's well asked. Everyone likes to focus on Class 3 as the driver of pool value and negative PPDs. Can you comment on why Class 4 remains low, particularly in comparison to international values? Why is skim milk powder not allowed to be sold in the U.S.? I don't know, but that's true or not. But NDM seems to be well, we'll just stop there with that part of the question. So let's talk about that Class 3, Class 4 ratio in comparison and values and price discovery.
Okay, well, from a standpoint of the skim milk powder, that's out of my bailiwick, so I can't answer that. But certainly the Class 4 price, every now and then does, well, as we all know, Class 1 usually is the highest price. Class 2, Class 3, Class 4 was the kind of original concept. But Class 4 does exceed Class 3 from time to time. And when that does happen, there is depooling of Class 3 milk if, again, it fits into the same product pricing mechanism. So I wouldn't say that just because I always talk about Class 3, it's just traditionally the Class 3 price is the one that rises above the depooling threshold. But it has happened on Class 4 in the past. So it's a function of the product formula, what the prices are, and what the other class prices are and their utilization. I don't know if I completely answered that, but that's my shot. So
Corey, can I weigh in on a comment on this?
Go ahead.
So I know there's a lot of tension, right? A lot of tension in the producer community because of the difference between Class 3 and Class 4, and certainly certain things that happened during the pandemic exasperated that spread. But we need to, I think, take a breath and step back, because we went through a period of investing in powder plants here in the United States, right? It seems like there is a follow the leader approach when you're deciding what you're going to invest in plants. And so it goes in waves. We just completed a wave of a lot of investment in Class 4 manufacturing plants. And now it's flipped. It's flipping to Class 3. We've got a new plant in Michigan. There's other plants coming online. I think we're going to see more Class 3 capacity being built over the next period of time, years, than Class 4. And as that happens, I think the price difference between Class 4 and Class 3 narrows quite a bit. And so as we think about what we want going forward, I think we have to think in the future and not think about how it was in the past.
We're going to do a quick poll question here. We're going to start with Chris. We talked about, we've consolidated federal orders quite a bit here. And in 15 seconds, I'm going to go Chris, Ed, Al on this one. Is it time to consider more consolidation or reconfiguration in federal orders? Is there a possibility to do that? 15 seconds. Chris, you're first.
Strictly consolidation?
Yep. Yep.
Not if it's that. There's other things I would do, but not consolidate the way the pricing works now.
What might you do in 10 seconds?
Well, I think I might make a bigger change, like separating out the balancing volatility from some of the other class, in particular class 1 volatility.
Okay. Ed?
As it makes sense, there could be more consolidation. I wouldn't mandate it, but there's probably some potential consolidation that could occur between some.
Yeah. Al?
Certainly the Kentucky down to Florida can kind of be fit together. I think the upper Midwest going all the way to Idaho, Pacific Northwest could work. I could see 5 as the maximum number. And then once you start going there, why not national? Because I think those regions are just that much different. You really can't force them together.
Okay. I'm going to take the next question here. It comes in, how much of the butterfat change was accomplished through changing breeds from Holstein to Jersey? I think that one of the easiest ways, many of you know I'm managing editor Hoard's Dairyman, but I'm also president of Holstein Association USA, so I want to disclose that to our audience. But if you look at the NAB numbers, that's the National Association of Animal Breeders, and look at the units of semen sold in 2020, it tells you what the makeup of the breed is in the national dairy herd. And from the Jersey Journal this month, that number is about 15% of semen sales were the Jersey breed, and about 80% in the U.S. is Holstein. So between you adding those two up, 95% of the breeds in the U.S. are predominantly Holstein and Jersey. So what is really happening is you're seeing a shift of genetics of the whole population. If you wind back to pre-World War II, a third of the U.S. dairy herd was Guernseys, actually, and Jersey was big. So this is a genetic change and a feeding change of what's happening in our herd here. So a real good thing there. Chris, I'm going to take this one real quick to you. We hear a number that there was 725 million lost due to negative PPDs. People talk about that number. It's cited by National Milk. The audience member says, is there a way to recapture it? My quick take is no, those milk checks have been issued. Would you agree or disagree?
Well, I don't know that there's a way to recapture it. I think there might be a way. Well, there's multiple ways that you might change it going forward so that you didn't have that happen again. And I think that's part of the discussion. And I think it's perfectly reasonable to take a look at that and consider whether that's operating the way it was supposed to be working and the way, kind of everybody agreed on it. But my sense of it is that there's not widespread agreement at this point, but maybe we'll get there. And, Alan would know more than I would on some of that stuff, so.
Al, excuse me, would having just 2 classes of milk, one for fluid and one for manufacturing, fix some of the problems?
Oh, gosh, I'm thinking back in the 80s, that was something that I supported strongly, that we need fewer classes rather than more. Yes, 2 classes of milk could easily be handled. It could, now granted, that second class may not be as high, it's going to be a roll up of 2, 3, and 4. So it may not be the highest class. You could probably maybe just pool differentials. You don't even need class prices. There's so many different changes that can be made to, quote, simplify. But again, I don't think you can ever simplify the other orders just by changing the number of classes.
Erin, this question came in very early today, and the question is, how are the rules set for class 2, 3, 4 milk to move in and out of the pool? And that's really through the federal order system that those rules are set. You want to talk about that briefly?
Sure. So the federal order system, we consider 2 types of handlers. There's our class 1 processors, and then our manufacturing handlers that do, 2, 3, and 4 products. And the way the rules are set up is class 1 handlers, are required to be regulated if they sell product into a marketing area. They don't have a choice. They have to be regulated, and they pay minimum class 5 prices. Because the order is set up to make sure that the fluid needs of the consumer are always met. So that allows our class 2, 3, and 4 processors or manufacturers to make a decision on whether they want to participate in the pool. And that's this conversation that we've been talking about, de-pooling. It's really not de-pooling, it's just choosing to not pool on this month. You either pool the milk or you don't. And so depending on the class price relationships is when those manufacturing handlers will make a business decision on to whether or not they want to pool the milk. Often it's because they're going to get a draw from the pool that help them pay their producers the minimum uniform price. So they want to participate. There's a benefit for them participating, and so they choose to do that. When class prices are inverted, and instead of receiving a payment from the pool, they might have to pay into the pool. Well, the rules aren't set up to make them participate. So they have a business decision to decide whether they're going to participate and pay into the pool or not, and they can maintain that market revenue and choose to share it with producers that supply them.
Thank you, Erin.
Hey, Corey, can I weigh in on the multiple classes? So, it's important to have the multiple classes. Certainly, there's a different price value for milk going to cheese at many times than the value of milk going to butter powder. And in order to create the stability for all dairy farmers under federal orders, it's important that a dairy farmer in itself or of itself is indifferent to which one of those plants they ship to. And that's what the blend price does. It makes it indifferent to the producer, indifferent to the cooperative if they ship to class 1, 2, 3, or 4, which is important because if there's a big negative differential in price between 3 and 4, you don't have the producers trying to that would normally go to 4 trying to undercut the class 3 market to get landed there. Think about where we were during the pandemic when there was a $10 difference between 3 and 4. You don't think if somebody only got paid that class 4 price, they wouldn't have had lots of room to move their milk to a class 3 plant and undercut the pricing at class 3 plants and bring the milk price down to all the producers. And so that's what the original reason of federal orders was, to prevent that destructive price competition between dairy farmers. And that's why we have market-wide pooling and classified pricing.
And I've got to jump in because competitive milk pricing versus end product pricing solves some of that problem, because milk flows to its highest value if you're pricing it on competitive and not formula pricing. Plus capacity, cheese capacity is limited. So not every ounce of milk that goes into powder would try to disruptively go into a cheese plant, because cheese plants can only buy so much milk from a capacity, and they can only sell so much cheese as their customers want. No one just buys cheese to put it in a warehouse. So there's a lot of, again, nuances are important, but at the same time, and consequences come from different changes. But I would argue that there's another side of the coin that Ed just brought up.
Thank you. A regular commentator, Andy Novakovic, chimes in here. If we set a higher price than the international market, we couldn't clear 3/4 of the powder on the world market. If we tried to set a much higher domestic price, we become an importer. We can't have our domestic cake and eat the world market as well. So, these are very interlinked situations here. We're approaching the top of the hour. I'm going to try to get through a few more questions. Ed, you got 30 seconds for this one. How does a farmer do risk management when depooling disrupts all the formulas and causes farmers to not get the prices they should?
Yeah, that is a challenge. Certainly in the most recent go around, if you were shipping to a class 3 handler, you should have gotten a lot of that depooling revenue back one way or another. At DFA, that's what happened. So it does help balance it out. But at the end of the day, that there is a challenge with depooling and negative PPDs that can impede risk management. You do have to think about that.
Al, this question comes to you from a comment you made earlier. I'm curious how competitive price formulas can show independence from price discovery mechanisms of the federal milk marketing order price discovery. Nearly all the prices outside the pool are highly correlated with prices inside the pool. Comment?
Okay, well, again, I'm talking the prices paid to farmers, not the prices for cheese and actual commodities. But at the same time, you almost would have to have unregulated milk into that competitive price series to get true competition and finding out what the value of milk really is.
Well, thank you, Al. We are going to wrap up the question portion of our panel here. We thank our commentators for going through these questions. We still had some that weren't unanswered, but we tried to roll them in to each other here to get as many answered as we can. Our next dairy live stream will focus on options and opportunities for marketing my milk. The show will air on May 19th, 2021 at 11 a.m. Central Daylight Time. And it will be archived on Hoard's Dairyman YouTube channel the very next day. And we look forward to seeing you on that webcast. On behalf of Ed Gallagher, Al Zolin, Erin Taylor, and Chris Wolf, I'm Corey Geiger, your host of Dairy Livestream. And thank you for joining us today. We appreciate your audience and attention. Thank you. Have a great day, everyone.